Well, thank you so much. Actually, my wife is from the Dominican Republic. Her guitar is used for Dominican folk music, and one of these days she'll have to come on stage. She's extraordinary. Anyway, thanks everybody for joining me. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen because we're doing a PowerPoint to have some visual sense of what I want to discuss. So if you'll just give me a second to get all these things in place, I'm going to share it. And so, yeah, front and back cover of the book, Folk Singers in the Bureau. Somehow I got to start writing books without subheads, maybe just single words. But, for now, I think we're going to have to live with this. Repeater Books did a really good job with the cover. There's actually all kinds of things going on. There's Woody Guthrie here. This Machine Kills Fascists, which was a Woody credo, Burl Ives' name. This symbol here is actually an adaptation of the Communist International logo, which kind of gets at the intersection of the folk singers and the Bureau. But before I want to start, I wanted to kind of make this manifest itself. I had never actually seen any footage of Woody Guthrie, and apparently the reason is there really isn't much, but I did find this one clip, Woody doing an old cowboy song, Ranger's Command, and I just wanted to share that to start this off.
Two fragments of film survive of Guthrie performing. One of them, lost in the archives for 40 years, has only just come to light.
But the rustlers broke on us in the dead hours of night. She rose from her blanket, a battle to fight. She rose from her blanket with a gun in each hand, said, "Come all of you cowboys, fight for your land."
Yeah, so, that's Woody in 1945. This is a picture, it's probably CBS radio studios in the late 40s. This was when radio was still preeminent over television. Alan Lomax had a show, Back Where I Come From, and he was able to popularize and bring on a lot of these essentially left-wing folk artists. But he also brought it. Lomax, we'll talk about in a minute. He loved this particular kind of music, and he embraced it pretty broadly. But he was himself, part of this left-wing folk milieu. This is a young Lee Hays who would later join the Weavers. This is Burl Ives. For all you young people out there, Sam the Snowman from Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer every year. But Burl Ives would actually be a Big Daddy in Cat on the Hot Tin Roof. He was a famous actor, Academy Award winner, I believe. This is Cisco Houston, who was a much smoother singer, but he was a close confidant and buddy of Woody Guthrie. They were in the Merchant Marine together. So see, these are some of the people we're going to talk about, but I wanted to give an overview of what this book deals with. What I discovered in going through this, I was going to write this book on the 60s and rock musicians. I'd done these books on Maoism and the Communist Party, and I wanted to shift it up more into a cultural focus. But I was not getting any FBI files on groups like Jefferson Airplane or MC5, Sam Cooke, Nina Simone. It's not that they weren't there. Some of them were destroyed. Some of them weren't available. It just wasn't coming together in such a way that I could do it. I've since figured out a way I can approach this, which is not entirely focused on the FBI, but that's a work in progress. But in the course of working on this, I read this book by Sean Wilentz, Bob Dylan in America, and he talks about Woody Guthrie. And as I'm reading his description of Guthrie, I'm like, wow, Guthrie was a communist. I mean, this is old news for people who are huge Guthrie fanatics and for historians. But in the mainstream, there's this view that, Woody Guthrie was a free spirit. He hung around a lot with the left. He wasn't really, a party person. He didn't have the discipline, et cetera, et cetera. But I was curious. I sent away and actually got his FBI file. And it raised as many questions as it answered. I later actually got his New York and Los Angeles files, which filled in a lot of blanks and made it a much clearer picture. But it also said to me that if Woody Guthrie has this file, I know Pete Seeger has this file, let me get his. That came. And then I thought, well, let me get Lee Hays's file. And, sure enough, it was there. I had to wait a couple years. It came. Bess Lomax, who wrote this song, the MTA, about Charlie taking the subway in Boston. She has like 500-page file. Cisco Houston has a file. Millard Lampell. All of these people have files. And the reason they have files is they were at key points, either members of the Communist Party or very close supporters. And here I don't want to, I don't want to sugarcoat this. Most of these folks were actually in the party for periods. Some stayed longer than others. And that's why they had FBI files. And, my view on that is, the old left in the 30s and 40s was a thing. I mean, it was, you could probably make a comparison to the Democratic Socialists today. I mean, the difference was they supported the Soviet Union. I mean, that dream would end up collapsing. And that's a very long story that I'm going to try to not try to deal with any concision here. But to say most of the folks we're talking about here joined this party because they were growing up in Depression-era United States. They didn't like the unemployment. They didn't like the Jim Crow laws. They didn't like lynching. They didn't like people being evicted. And they sought answers. And for many of them, the Communist Party seemed to have those answers. For our folk singers, as a result of their affiliation, they were under the unrelenting attention of the FBI, the Congress, media, and various right-wing groups. And all of this was bound up in, what's come to be known as the Second Red Scare, where the United States, coming out of World War II, is the most powerful country in the world and has made a conscious decision to destroy the Communist Party and destroy its influence throughout the U.S., which means, our folk singers, who had various relationships to that ideology and trend were going to be, they had a mark on their back. So among those, I want to do some brief bios and then kind of do a very quick tour of the book of the areas it talks about. But the first person to talk about is Woody, who comes out of Okemah, Oklahoma. This picture is very interesting. This is from his New York FBI file. You can see it has his brand, "This Machine Kills Fascists," written on its guitar. This picture is taken in Spokane, Washington. What's interesting is it's in his FBI file, and it was taken by an informant, who obviously said, "Woody, here, let me get a picture." And it makes its way to the FBI file. It actually looks like a publicity shot, but the slip attached to it said, this comes from redacted, who was at a recent conference in Spokane. Woody comes out of Okemah. He has a hard time growing up. His mom had Huntington's chorea, degenerative neurological disease, and ended up being institutionalized. So his home life is shattered. He marries, he has a family, but he's pretty rootless. He takes the family to Texas and then to California. And in California, he's on the radio singing with his his cousin Christine, what's her name? I forget her first name. Chrisman is her last name, and she's nicknamed Lefty Lou because she's left-handed. But Woody is on the radio in Southern California, and he meets this guy, Ed Robin, who is a writer for the West Coast Communist Party newspaper. And it's there that Woody gets introduced to left-wing politics. It's also where he meets Will Geer, the actor from the Waltons. Geer is also a Communist Party member. And Geer tells Woody, you have to go to New York. That's where it's happening. And Woody actually does that. He hitchhikes to New York, listening to, I guess, various radio broadcasts of Irving Berlin, God Bless America, and getting really incensed by the blind patriotism. And he pens this song, which would later become This Land Is Your Land. There's a lot more I could say about that, but for now, that's how Woody quickly comes from Okemah to California to New York. In New York, he's going to meet Pete Seeger. Pete Seeger comes from an intellectual middle-class family. His father, Charles Seeger, is a musicology professor. His mother is also an educated musicologist, I believe. He goes to Harvard to study journalism. He is in the Young Communist League at that point. He drops out of Harvard. He's hitchhiking around New York. He discovers the banjo. He decides he wants to be a singer. He ends up moving down to New York City. His father is also in the Communist Party in this composers collective. His father quits in 1939 when the Soviet Union and Germany signed this non-aggression pact. His father feels that this is a betrayal of, these anti-fascist principles. A lot of people are alienated from the Communist Party at this point. Seeger stays. The whole discussion of that pact is worth to get into. Volumes have been written on it. It's not as simple or as straightforward as anybody thinks, which is not to say there was not a right and a wrong thing to do. But Seeger stays in the Young Communist League, and he actually joins the party, and he is based in New York City. So he's in New York when Woody gets there. Lee Hays, who comes out of rural Arkansas, his father is a Methodist preacher, is killed when Lee is young. Lee leaves home. He gets a job in the library in Ohio. He gets introduced to socialist politics. He wants to be a documentary filmmaker initially, and he's doing films on sharecropping. Particularly, there were entities which attempted to break the barrier between Black and white sharecroppers, all poor people, and cross that racial divide. And Lee Hays was very keen to do that. It's very impressive. These folks are very, they're willing to stick their neck out on things that could get them in a lot of trouble. And this is, across all class and race barriers. There's a lot in my book that I criticize about some of the politics that they were embracing, but there's also a lot that's that needs to be really looked at, and I don't know if commended is the right word, but maybe appreciated is the right word. Anyway, Lee Hays, he ends up going back to Arkansas and works at Commonwealth College, which is a left-wing labor school. And it seems like he might get recruited into the party, or at least he becomes very close. I've never really established if Lee Hays was in the party. He had, all these musicians have discipline issues. I guess that's what makes them musicians, artists, having to fit into a democratic centralist group is no mean feat. But he is close to the party, and he stays close for many years. From Arkansas, he moves up to Philadelphia. And from Philadelphia, he moves up to New York. So all these folks are converging in New York City in the late 30s into 1940. Alan Lomax comes out of Austin, Texas. He also goes to Harvard. He meets the left-wing politics representatives of the party there. He actually quits Harvard. He goes back to Austin and works with his father, John Lomax. And they're song collectors. They travel throughout the South in workhouses and in prison. His father is more conservative. Alan is more left inclined, but they both have this passion for music. I'm just noticing now the price tag is on this guitar. I'm wondering if he just bought the guitar or it's just a prop. I think that's the real story, people. What's that price tag all about? Anyway, Alan Lomax, he goes from Harvard and he gets a job eventually after going back from the University of Austin, I believe. He gets a job in the Library of Congress, a very influential position, developing this Folklife Center in the Library of Congress. So he has a position where he can actually be a benefactor for these artists who would otherwise become, they just fall through the cracks. I mean, it's a funny thing about the United States is the soft repression that happens is almost as insidious as the hard repression. It's like you could have wonderful music and great things to say, but if nobody plays it, it's as if you don't exist. Well, Lomax made sure that people like Seeger and Guthrie were heard. And one of the people he discovers, him and his father discovered this guy, Hootie Ledbetter, who's in Angola prison farm. Now, Leadbelly is a trip. Leadbelly was in prison twice, once for manslaughter, which seemed to have been, over, a love triangle of sorts, for shorthand. He got out of prison for that, but then he ended up back in jail for a beef he had. He was probably a little high on alcohol. There was a Salvation Army band playing, and Leadbelly was dancing. And a couple of white guys took issue with it. They thought he was ridiculing the band, and the fight ensued, and a white guy got cut, and Leadbelly went to prison, which was about what you would expect in 1930s Louisiana. But Leadbelly is crazy good. George Harrison would later say, Lonnie Donegan did this song Rock Island Line. Well, without Leadbelly, there would have been no Lonnie Donegan. And without Lonnie Donegan, there would be no Beatles, which is, I think that's accurate. And I think it's more accurate than John Lennon had something to say about no Elvis, no Beatles, which, everybody's part of this, all of this music percolates together and lays the basis for some things. But I think Leadbelly is arguably a lot more original than Elvis. I mean, Elvis actually drew on a lot of people. Leadbelly, I think, actually was very creative, although he drew on people himself. So, Leadbelly himself is not really political, but he is being, popularized by these folks. His song Bourgeois Blues actually documents him driving around Washington after Alan Lomax's landlord had castigated Lomax for having Leadbelly and his wife stay in his apartment. You're having black people stay in this apartment and you're white people. And Leadbelly's Bourgeois Blues is a slam at that incident. And the song is actually written when Lomax, Elizabeth Barnacle, who's an NYU professor, and Leadbelly and his wife are riding around talking about the incident. And Elizabeth Barnacle keeps talking about these bourgeois and their stupid laws, blah, blah, blah. So Leadbelly picks that up and turns it into a song. So he's being influenced, even though he's not. I've never seen any evidence of him having been in the party, but he's kind of taking in the oxygen that's created from the fact that this party exists. And that's part of, I think, one of the things this book is trying to excavate. It's not a matter, to look at the popular cultures. Nobody was ever in the Communist Party. Everybody was just a tangential supporter. because it was turned into such a pariah ideology. And I was trying to take those blinders off and look at it more or less as it was at the time and how people looked at it, and then actually look at, what the legacy of it is. And it's like, without this party, how would you get, Jewish intellectuals, or this woman, Sis Cunningham out of Oklahoma, who she was a music teacher, trained, middle class type of existence. She becomes a party partisan. She's actually more politically sophisticated. She talks about going to a certain training and reading Das Kapital and understanding, the Marxist concept of law of value. She ends up moving to New York with her husband, Gordon Friesen. But back on my point, it's like people like Sis, Leadbelly, Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie, all in the same room, all making music. How is that possible without some kind of organizational instrument that can strip off the barriers? And looking back, one does have to have a certain awe, at the fact that it happened at all. And then Josh White, he comes out of South Carolina. He is touring with blind musicians in the South. He's the eyes and ears, but he is his voice is smoother and more refined, and he's singing these blues songs, that he's learning in the course of being an usher for these various people. He comes up to New York. He meets Paul Robeson, this towering operatic figure, and gets introduced into the left-wing folk milieu, which will later cause him a great deal of personal conflict and put his career in jeopardy. So all these people, end up in New York, as if by accident. I guess there's a movie, right? Somebody needs to make this Grapes of Wrath evening movie, that movie they just made of One Night in Miami with Malcolm, Sam Cooke, and Muhammad Ali. Well, there's this Grapes of Wrath evening that Will Geer has organized. I guess it's after official Broadway closed. They rent out this theater, and they have Will Geer, Alan Lomax, Aunt Molly Jackson, who's out of Kentucky, Leadbelly, Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, and they all perform. This is when Seeger meets Woody Guthrie. So this is like a historic moment, right? And Alan Lomax, this is when he first meets Woody Guthrie, and Lomax is smart enough to understand Woody is special. I mean, I know music is subjective and people have their personal likes and dislikes, but I will say that nobody is like Woody Guthrie. I think Woody Guthrie and Leadbelly musically are the most singular, out of all the people I write. And that's not to diminish anything about these other people, but Woody is special. Even though he's stealing the melody from the Carter families, it's like there's something about him. My wife says they have this phrase in the Dominican Republic where if an artist has that special thing, they call it duende, which I guess is something like a little magical troll or something like that. It's a great phrase because Woody definitely has duende. Leadbelly definitely has duende. You can hear it from the first minute they start singing. Lomax recognizes that, and he essentially makes it his mission in life to make sure people know about it, as well as these other people. Woody and Pete actually take a tour. They go down to Oklahoma right after the Grapes of Wrath, and they visit the Communist Party in Oklahoma City, I'm going to say. I may have that fact a little off. And it's there that they write this famous song, Union Maid, which I don't want to do a big explanation of that now, but they're down there meeting with union people and Communist Party people. 2 months later, state authorities raid all of these things and they arrest people and charge them with criminal sedition. They raid a bookstore. I think there's this volume called Books on Trial about this incident. It's really worth reading. They raid this bookstore. They actually arrest all the customers in there because, it's carrying communist works. These people are convicted and sentenced. They ended up having their sentences dropped because the situation in the world changed. But Seeger and Guthrie, had they been there at that time, they too would, Seeger talks about this directly. If we had been there, we would have been arrested as well. But they're not. They come back. They form this group called the Almanac Singers, and they're doing songs that are in sync with the Communist Party's line. And their line is, "The Yanks aren't coming." The communists in 1939, 1940 are saying, let's stay out of the war. We just had World War I. We have no interest in this. And it's in line with the non-aggression pact that Germany and the Soviet Union have passed. They're basically following the behests of the national security issues of the Soviet Union. But they do these album of anti-war songs. Some of them are really quite good. If you can just kind of hear them out of context. And there's this article in Atlantic saying probably some of these songs fall under criminal provisions of the Selective Service Act. And to that extent, it's a matter for the Attorney General, because Roosevelt had signed an order saying, if you're a man between, I think, 18 and 45, you have to sign up for the draft. And Almanacs had this song saying C for conscription, which they called this goddamn bill, railing against it. So the writer in the Atlantic is essentially saying maybe we ought to prosecute the Almanac Singers. And it's at this point that the FBI files start opening up. J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI, is getting a lot more funding. And the files are exponentially growing. The FBI grows from several hundred members to many thousand. By the end of the war, they're going to have, I believe, over 10,000 people in their whole organization, agents and support staff. The Almanacs dodge consequences because World War II breaks out and the party's line shifts. The Soviet Union is invaded. The Communist Party is saying we need to protect socialism. The Communist Party sends 13,000 people into the army. I mean, you actually join the army, quit the party because you can't go to meetings and maintain the discipline. But the party is all in for the US in World War II, including taking a pretty reprehensible stand about the incarceration of Japanese, the detention of Japanese. I mean, they basically supported it as part of supporting the wider war effort. And even to this day, they have a really bad accounting of that time. Regardless, this ends the Almanacs doing anti-war stuff. Most of these artists end up going into the army. Alan Lomax and Sis Cunningham's husband get work in the Office of War Information doing propaganda for the U.S. Pete Seeger is in the Army. Woody Guthrie's in the Merchant Marine. But he later gets his merchant marine papers pulled, and he's drafted. So he goes in toward the end of the war, but they're still under surveillance. The FBI files continue to accumulate. Military intelligence is following them, and they're researching any civilian employees who are doing war work under the Hatch Act, which says, you can't be part of a organization that advocates the overthrow of the government. If you're working for the government. So I'm going to have to kind of compress things a little bit because I do want to leave a little bit of time here for questions and stuff. And I see the clock is moving ahead brutally. Anyway, so the war ends. For a while, there's a status quo. The US and the Soviets have been allies, but that's quickly falling apart. And the outlines of the Cold War are beginning. And the first targets of that are the Hollywood writers. Here you see Dalton Trumbo and some of the other Hollywood 10. They were called before Congress. They refused to cooperate. They were sent to prison for a year. Harry Truman signs an executive order demanding loyalty oaths for government employees. The Taft-Hartley Act is passed, which says you can't be a communist and be in a union leadership position, which undermines a lot of the power of the Communist Party, who had influential people in positions in the Congress of Industrial Organizations. It's the beginning of a whole-out drive to drive communism from U.S. society, from the public square, from the cultural realm, to the media realm. It's suddenly becoming a communist is not only undesirable, it's unacceptable and intolerable. The Communist Party themselves, it takes them a while to kind of get the memo. They go all in supporting this guy, Henry Wallace, in 1948 when he runs for president. This is Pete Seeger has got this group called People Songs, which they're supporting Wallace all throughout the country in rallies. They're manning his offices. To their credit, they're demanding that any rally not be segregated, which was a real hot potato in the South, but they stuck to it. Wallace himself is not a communist, but he's willing to work with them because he doesn't want a war with the Soviet Union. He wants to kind of keep this grand alliance going that had come up. He's actually anti-communist, but he's willing to work with them. He loses terribly to not only Harry Truman and John Dewey, but Strom Thurmond actually beat him out under a segregationist ticket. So it's a huge defeat for the left. And it's part of things that are just getting worse. Meantime, Paul Robeson, who's this huge figure, he's an actor, he's a singer, he's an athlete. He gives a speech in Europe, which is mischaracterized as saying, Black people aren't going to fight for the US. So there's this huge Fox News moment for Robeson where they're saying, how dare he speak for Black people? Whereas once he was embraced and extolled, suddenly he is being maligned. And that leads to this incident in Peekskill. I want to show a short clip which briefly captures, what happened in Peekskill in 1949.
The reaction to Robeson speaking out politically in Europe was to erupt in Peekskill, New York. He had scheduled on his return a 4th annual concert for the Civil Rights Congress in Peekskill. However, those who wanted his outspoken voice stilled threatened violence if Robeson sang. Protesters paraded. Despite the threats, on September 4th, 1949, Robeson came to sing. Spectators jeered on the sidelines at the people who came to listen.
There's a group of young boys here yelling at the people stopped in their cars. There are hundreds and hundreds of people here, and if there's a serious outbreak, it will be very bad.
Because the concert was ringed with a threat of violence, hundreds of concert-goers volunteered and stood a circle of guard around the audience and around Robeson himself. When the concert was over, the police did little or nothing to avoid a confrontation. The concert-goers were attacked as they left, and a riot developed. 140 people were injured.
Skirmishes are breaking out all over here. The police are fighting the cops. Oh, this is terrible. And they are beating up a Negro. They're clubbing him. He's right here.
After Peekskill, other cities became fearful. Concerts were canceled. Robeson records were withdrawn from stores. Robeson continued to speak out, and condemnation of the man and his beliefs continued.
Yeah, so Peekskill is pretty bad, and the book gets into it in a lot more detail. I mean, maybe what the worst part of Peekskill is how contemporary it feels when you actually look at it. But it was anti-Semitic, it was racist, and it was anti-communist, all balled up into one. And the governor did a report. Dewey did a report afterwards. One thing that happened is the cross was burned. And the governor said, oh, that was just a prank that went bad by youth. I mean, he's totally dismissed, this quintessential symbolism of the Ku Klux Klan. Peekskill happened at a time when the leadership of the Communist Party was put on trial for violating the Smith Act, for teaching the advocacy of revolution, not for actually planning revolution, but for teaching it. I mean, they literally read the Communist Manifesto into the court transcripts. They're all convicted, and this is part of a wave of trials against the leadership of the Communist Party under the Smith Act that would go on from 1949, until the end of the 50s, when the Supreme Court finally put a break on it. And it led to all kinds of disarray for the Communist Party itself. They tried to go underground, which just made matters worse. The book gets into this in some detail, and I think it's pretty fascinating stuff. If Gus Hall actually tries to go underground in Mexico, he crosses the border, but a informer had dropped a dime on him, so he's in his hotel, and the Mexican police crash in, and he's summarily sent back to the U.S. No due process or anything. I mean, there's all kinds of interesting stories about this period. And all this has happened before Joe McCarthy shows up, which, I mean, one of the things I hope people get from reading the book is seeing that there's a difference between the second Red Scare and the McCarthy era. I mean, because, U.S. history, it's like you got good guys and bad guys, and everything gets very simplistic. And we're like, oh, Joe McCarthy, he was bad. And then Edward R. Murrow said Joe McCarthy was bad. And then McCarthy, was challenged at long last, have you no decency? And then that was over. And, then things were different. Well, McCarthy comes on the scene after the Red Scare has already been going on, and he leaves before it ever ends. And, this guy next to him, Bobby Kennedy, was like working with Joe McCarthy. Bobby Kennedy, his firstborn, Joe McCarthy's the godfather, right? Bobby Kennedy is the guy who signs the wiretap order on Martin Luther King. In other words, the Red Scare is part of a bigger effort by the overall consensus in the power structure, which, when Joe McCarthy started going at the military, that consensus shifted. Regardless, it all operates within a larger effort to extricate communism from U.S. society. And I think as you read through this, you'll get a deeper sense of that. Meanwhile, people are being called in front of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. Josh White is called, and he doesn't really acquit himself well. I mean, he makes an important statement about civil rights and how he's not going to back off from that. But he says, he was a sucker. The communists used him, and kind of said what needed to be said for the powers that be, which was to telling, Black people, to the degree they looked at him as a role model, to stay away from this. As far as him talking about civil rights and such, Congress didn't want to hear that. They let him read his statement, but that wasn't really why he was called up. His career went on, but it was never quite the same. Other people fared better. Burl Ives actually named some names, and he was actually able to go on and be successful. I'm not going to talk about Harvey Matusow right now because I kind of want to move this ahead, but he's a very interesting character, which I'll just leave it at that. Maybe that'll be a tease to pick up the book. The Weavers in 1950-52 were like top of the charts. They had this song, Goodnight Irene. They had So Long, It's Been Good to Know You. They did Sloop John B., which the Beach Boys later had as a hit. They were top of the charts, but this guy had basically named them as communists, and they were relegated to playing the worst clubs possible. So this is Pete Seeger, Lee Hays, Ronnie Gilbert, and Fred Hellerman. So they are driven from the public square. They're allowed to sing, but not not at the big important clubs, definitely not on television, not on radio. So this is moving into a period where people like Seeger and Lee Hays are actually being called in front of HUAC. They're having to be concerned about, do I not answer questions and brand myself as a communist by taking the fifth? Or do I, which is what Lee Hays did, or Pete Seeger actually took the tack of saying, there's a First Amendment, you don't have the right to pry into this. Unfortunately for Pete Seeger, they actually do have the right to pry into this. He spent the next 6 or so years fighting off imprisonment for refusing to answer their questions. I mean, things changed by 62, 63, and his sentence was eventually thrown out, not because they felt like he was innocent, but they felt like, well, Congress didn't really explain to him that you either answer, you're going to go to jail. I mean, that's kind of the shorthand. So that's an overview, very quick. Probably, I always feel very hesitant. World War II is such a major event, and it's really hard to give any sense of the scope and sweep of how everything pivots around that. But essentially, that's the arc. These people, they're young, they gravitate toward these politics, they meet, in New York, they're activists, they follow a certain position, and then when things in the world change after the war, they are suddenly, not embraced, they're actually targeted. They all have files. Pretty much all of them are on this thing called the Security Index, which means if there's a crisis like war, they're going to be put in essentially concentration camps. Every 6 months, the FBI wants to know where they live so they can come and get them. They're pariahs, and they're not welcome as public figures. All of which is to say, as things change, things change with them. Well, first off, Alan Lomax, he avoided HUAC by having to go to England. He leaves his position in the Library of Congress, so there's suddenly no longer this outlet for these artists to be popularized. He eventually comes back in the later 50s, but things in the world have changed. Sis Cunningham and her husband, Gordon Friesen, they're not really allowed to work in music throughout the 50s. In the early 60s, they start this magazine called Broadside Magazine. They publish the works of Phil Oakes and Bob Dylan. So they end up, Sis Cunningham and Gordon Friesen are kind of, they're always on the ground fighting the good fight, and they never seem to stop it. And they actually had some remarkable successes. Broadside really was doing some stuff that nobody else was doing. Lee Hays, he remained on the FBI's index until 72, even though he wasn't much of an activist. This is him and Pete up in the Hudson Valley. Cisco Houston, I didn't talk about much, but in 1961, the FBI files a report that they're checking up on on Cisco, who has stomach cancer. And he died. And they're trying to figure out what to do with his file. And they're like, in view of the above, it would appear no further investigation is necessary. I mean, this is, cynical bureaucraties. Cisco's dead, and they're like, well, guess we don't have to do anything else. I mean, it's just an indication of the level of spite on the part of the FBI driving these things. Woody Guthrie famously, is suffering from Huntington's chorea. He's losing the ability to control his own body. At one point in the early 50s, they think he's an alcoholic, and Lee Hays and Fred Hellerman visit him, and they ask him, how he's doing. And he says, oh yeah, the food fine's, everything okay. I can jump up on a table and shout, I'm a communist, and all they say is, oh, he's crazy. You try doing that anywhere else in America, which I think really kind of captures just how repressive things were, because, it's only essentially in an insane asylum, to use the popular term, that you could say such a thing. Guthrie is followed throughout his life. He's losing his ability to speak and talk, and I got his New York FBI file. And there's all these records about, should we close the file? And they say, yeah, he's getting sick, close the file. Another one, should we close the file? No, yeah, we should close the file. But they never closed the file. And I realized that because here you see SI stands for Security Index, and it's crossed off. CI, they changed the name to Communist Index, and that's crossed off. But RCI, Reserve Communist Index, is not crossed off. So as near as I can tell, Woody is basically fodder for apprehension and detention up until the point he dies, even though he can't even walk. So that's pretty awful. Of course, once he's dead, he ends up on a postage stamp. He's, an American icon. Similarly, Bess Lomax, she has like 500 pages files. They're watching as she teaches at Cal State Northridge. They've got an informant, reporting on her meetings. She gets the National Medal of Arts from Bill Clinton. Once you're dead, they can turn you into something else, which is, not to diminish the award or things like that, but it's just no way Bess Lomax was getting any kind of attention like this in 1954. Alan Lomax, chased out of the country, set on a list for custodial detention, a Living Legend Award, shaking hands with Ronald Reagan. Pete Seeger, again, Bill Clinton. I mean, when he died, Chuck Schumer tweeted out from sea to shining sea, this land is your land, Pete Seeger, blah, blah, blah. In 1955, Chuck Schumer would have been putting as much distance between himself and Seeger as was possible. So, once you're dead, they turn you into something else. You can't represent yourself a certain way. But, I would argue these people, they were who they were. And, you don't have to like it, but don't reinvent the past. So that moves me to the end of this. Ideally, we would have 3 hours and I would play all kinds of music here, but that's not the case. So I wanted to just show you this. I have this playlist on YouTube. It's called Playlist for Aaron J. Leonard's the folk singer in the Bureau. And I've got some interesting songs, a remix, kind of a hip hop version of Which Side Are You On, which was done several years ago. Some original stuff by Woody Guthrie, the Almanacs, Roseanne Cash doing this great Woody song, some stuff by Leadbelly, Seeger. So, fire up your YouTube after this and let this playlist, go through and it'll bring these folks to life in an even better way. So let's see, I have to now stop this, close tabs. And so that is the end of the presentation. So obviously I got 3 books and I'm sure the good people at Malaprop Books will do everything in their power to get them in your hand if you're interested. The folk singer book itself is what we've talked about tonight. So that might be the thing that you want to get first, but the other 2 are, they tell me they're good reads. I try not to write books I wouldn't want to read. So, take that for whatever it's worth. And you can also go to my website, aaronleonard.net, where there's, various links to some readily available stuff to take a look at. So that I'm going to stop sharing. And Pat, I think I turn it back. Patricia, I think I turn this back over to you.
Well, thank you so much. I can't tell you how wonderful it was to see all those photographs I've not seen before, of course, in your book, but I particularly want to thank you for bringing it all together and giving us a great overview. And there's nothing like seeing the documents themselves that help people understand really what does it take. I wrote down to research, and I love it how you said, I sent away for this file or that file. It's kind of like, I ordered this, and what do you, when you say sent away, and you said you got one file like 2 years later, what does it take to get someone's file?
The FBI actually has a handy little website. Let's see if I can. I'm going to share the screen, and I'm going to open the internet. I'm going to close this.
And if anybody, while you're doing that, I'll just say that for those of you who have read the book, or if you haven't had a chance yet, Aaron does something so helpful. At the back of the book, he shows you with a helpful table, that the FBI files, what are the file numbers, the number of pages released. So he's going to show you something right now, Aaron. I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, so you can see this link. You just fill this out. First, you got to accept their terms of service. And they'll send you an email, and you answer that email by confirming it. And then you just fill in what you want. If it's for yourself, you just fill in your own information. If it's for somebody who's passed away, you just need to include an obituary. If it's for an organization, you should just explain what that is. If it's for somebody alive and it's not you, you need their permission. But basically, it's the internet. It's 2021. You know, just go here, https://efoia.fbi.gov/pound-terms, or just Google FBI EFOIPA, and that'll get you started. Yeah, sent away. I just on December 4th, I went to my mailbox and there was a compact disc from the FBI. I know my mailman must think, what the heck is this guy? I open it up and it's a file for Roy Martin Mitchell, who was an FBI agent. He was actually the special agent who handled William O'Neill. If you have seen the movie Judas and the Black Messiah, yes, the informer character is William O'Neill. So 5 years ago, I asked for the file of Roy Mitchell, and the file came on the 51st anniversary of the FBI and the Chicago police killing Fred Hampton. And if you go to my website, you can find the documentation. There's an article I wrote for Jacobin magazine. There, in Roy Mitchell's FBI file, is this memo commending him for his work aimed at the Black Panther Party. The memo is written within several days of Hampton getting killed, and it's giving Roy Mitchell a $200 bonus. So this was actually a breakthrough. I had talked to the attorneys, Jeff Haas and his partner. They had needed evidence like that when they brought suit against the government in the 70s to prove collusion between the FBI and the Chicago police in killing Fred Hampton. And I mention that because that all started by filling out this form 5 years ago. I mean, it took a while for it to come, but it came. There are some hidden secrets there, and some of them we'll get, some of them we won't. But it's right now it's the law, so take advantage of it.
So when we have a few minutes left on this event, and so I wanted to ask you. Your information at the back, of course, of your book indicates that there's a lot of things that you couldn't get access to. You mentioned earlier in your presentation, probably a lot of things have been destroyed, documents. So once you got to the end of your research and completed this book, what are some questions that are lingering for you? What's left to be told here that maybe you wish you could have discovered or
Well, with the folk singers, I tell you, I really ended up having more than I thought I would ever get. And I think probably because of the passage of time, nobody really cares about this stuff. I mean, who even knows who Bess Lomax is? I mean, our historical memory is so limited unless you're a historian and you're looking at a certain field. What actually it did for me is it made me appreciate a lot more. My wife is big into I mean, it's a cultural thing, appreciating your elders. And I don't think we do that enough in the United States. But, look, I came up in the early 70s, and folk music, that was corny. It just wasn't, my thing. It wasn't cool. I was wrong, because without that stuff, without Guthrie and Seeger and Bess Lomax and Sis Cunningham, there's no Bob Dylan, there's no Phil Oakes, there's no Beatles. The Beatles are like totally influenced by Dylan, and all this stuff just interacts. So it has led me to move into, I'm working on a book now that's deals with the great folk scare into the revolution in rock. And it's, there is some FBI stuff. The FBI has files on Jim Morrison and Grace Slick and things like that. But it's more insidious, It's like local authorities in Miami arrest Jim Morrison. They claimed he exposed himself when seems like what he was doing was really bad, drunken performance art. And he never actually exposed himself. But within days, they're organizing a rally of 30,000 people with Jackie Gleason and Anita Bryant for a rally for decency. So it's this conflict. This conflict propels things forward as much as we may like it or not. So I don't have so many unanswered questions about the past. Of course, you always learn new things, but I'm trying to move it ahead into the period called the long 60s.
So that's what you're working on now is
yes.
That era. And so where are you in your work? Are you still in the research phase or what's
Well, I got a contract. So I would say a year and a half, 2 years. So,
what's your process? How do you, as you're researching, are you writing at the same time? Or
I've always wanted somebody to ask me a question like that. It makes me feel like a writer. Yeah. My process is, I start out researching. I love it, right? I mean, it's all these databases. You go pull the newspapers, you pull the Senate investigation, you look through the back issues of Rolling Stone, you buy the secondary source literature, the book on Jefferson Airplane, the book on Phil Oakes. And, and then you ask the FBI for, I'm waiting for the National Archive to open because apparently there's a big file from Ed Sullivan, who was like this notorious anti-communist in the 50s, right? And his file is there for the taking if they ever open up the freaking thing. I mean, I know it's, people got to be safe. I respect that, but frustration nonetheless.
Research. We're waiting.
Yeah. So the process is first, if you don't have the raw material, you've got nothing special to say. It's kind of like the more I'm writing in my own voice means the less I actually have to say. It's like I need the hard information to attempt to synthesize it and then create a narrative, right? Because we like stories. It's how we make sense of this world, this universe, which isn't really a story at all, is it? It's just there. So thanks for that question, though.
You're so welcome. Thank you for your answer. I want to thank everybody who's joined us for this event. Thank you so much for supporting Malaprops. And we hope that if you haven't already, that you're going to pick up a copy of Aaron Leonard's The Folk Singers and the Bureau, because if you think of Burl Ives as just the, little snowman, or if you're just thinking of Woody Guthrie, as I originally did, of course, This Land Is Your Land, Jennifer Lopez singing her version of it at the Biden, inauguration. I was like, the ironies. So I want to encourage you to go to Aaron's website and check out, so many things came to my mind, Red Channels, the documentary Scandalize My Name, just so many things. That this book is rich and there for for you all to learn more about such an important time period in U.S. history, and so many people who are much more nuanced and complicated than maybe any of us ever thought. So thank you all for joining us. Go to malaprops.com to pick up any of these books that we've talked about tonight. Thank you again, Aaron. I'll see you here on the other side.